As Amos and Anne's children reached adulthood, all of them settled within 2 or 3 blocks of their parents. Sephora gives a description of each of Amos and Anne's children as she meets them.
George took me to see all the relatives, to make me acquainted. They all lived within a few blocks of each other. They made me feel very welcome. They had nice homes, large families, and were all very congenial and happy. All the other homes could be seen from the Clarke home at that time. The Amos Clarke family was a very religious and united family. The church came first, and Amos was always thrilled and pleased when his children took part and were active in the church. They all had an American organ, and all could sing pretty well. So George played the organ, and we all sang. George and I did duets. We blended well together. Every day we would visit around. Sam's widow, Olive Clarke, was a clerk in the People's Mercantile Store in Newton, one of the 2 stores in town. Amos Clarke was a stockholder in the General Mercantile Store. Olive's brother, Moroni Beck, was the manager of the People's Mercantile. The co-op store was the other general store. Bishop William Griffin, son-in-law to Amos and Anne, was the manager of the co-op, which I learned was a small branch of the ZCMI in Salt Lake City. Both stores were on Main Street, with a small wooden building, which was the post office, in between. The stores were owned by stockholders. Also, there was a tithing office, a meeting house, and an old rock schoolhouse, with a belfry in each to remind us of church and school. The school was across the street from the stores. Lizzie Griffin, Amos's 3rd child, had 8 lovely children at that time. Later the family grew by 2 more children. She was so like George in her nature, so quiet and sweet. She said she could remember my mother when she was a little girl in Rose.
Lizzie and William Griffin's children were Henry Leroy, Mary Elizabeth, Heber George, Nettie Ann, Amos Reuben, David Hiram, Howard Samuel, Lulu Viola, and Spencer Granville.
Her husband was William Hiram Griffin. At 21 years of age, he was one of the first settlers in Newton in 1869. In 1877, he was chosen second counselor to Bishop William F. Rigby. Later, he served as first counselor and eventually as bishop. He served in the Newton bishopric for 26 years. After serving a mission to England, he was called to be the patriarch of the Benson stake. From 1874 to about 1884, Newton was involved in the United Order. At its height, the order included the co-op store, a co-op farm, a co-op threshing machine, and a co-op dry stock herd. William Griffin was the general supervisor for the Newton ward. There were many complex community problems that had to be solved. Operations, maintenance, the division of labor, and getting supplies needed to be organized. But William organized all of this in a good manner. Sephora continues.
Mary Clarke, Amos and Anne's 5th child, had 10 children at the time. A pair of twins and a little girl were born later. One earlier twin had died, so in all they had 14 children. Mebby, the eldest daughter, and I became very good friends later. Mary and her husband George Rigby were a lovely couple. George Rigby, who was a county sheriff for many years, was at home when we went to visit Mary. He remembered me as a little girl of 9 years old, when he and Uncle Amos were on a mission and came to visit our folks. George Rigby was a very handsome man.
In the back row, starting on the left, you see Elmer, Moses, Harold, Amos, Orella, Mary, and Ida. In the front there is Golden, Liberty, Sterling, Merle, Milton, and Gwen.
Sarah, Amos and Anne's 4th child, married William F. Rigby, Jr. He was a brother to George Rigby, and they lived on the next block. They had 12 children. Persis was the eldest, just 6 months older than I was. Letty, Persis' sister, was a couple of years younger, and all became good friends to me later. Annie, Amos and Anne's 2nd child, lived on the next block. She was married to John Jenkins. Annie had 15 children in all. She cried when she saw me, and told me how my mother and she played together in Rose before they left for America. Both were the same age. Annie married at 17.5 years of age. Later, I visited a lot at Annie's. She made me feel welcome.
Annie's husband, John Jenkins, had pioneered in 3 places: Newton, Utah, Star Valley, Wyoming, and Big Meadow, Idaho. He had accepted the doctrine of plural marriage and was married in 1873 to Annie in the Endowment House in Salt Lake City. John, Annie, and her mother Ann made the trip to Salt Lake City by ox team from Newton. While John was at his summer camp in Big Meadow near the Idaho Mink Creek Mountains, Annie was arrested by the marshals and taken to Ogden. Amos, her father, went with her, but she was released on account of it being an Idaho offense, and Utah had no jurisdiction over it. The case was dismissed. She had given birth to a little child, and that was the cause of the arrest. She named him Archie. Though Annie's life was not easy, she was faithful to her family and to her testimony all through her life.
Annie and John Jenkins' children were John Henry, David Robert, Sarah Ann, Mary Elizabeth, Sephora Jane, Junius Faramore, Ida Charlotte, Estella Naomi, George Edgar, Edna Elmira, Lauren Amos, Archie Abraham, Vanetta Vella, Donald Thomas, and Spencer Samuel.
Everywhere we went, we had to sing. Amos and Ann's 6th child, Amos Jr., and his wife Delia lived east on the next block from Amos Clarke's home. Amos and Deal, as she was always called, were a lovely, jolly couple. I fell in love with them. They had a nice home and 5 beautiful children. They were very good-looking and so happy. They lost the first child, Willie, and 2 were born later. They had an organ, and Deal played the accordion, so we had a real concert there and lots of fun. I felt like I had always known those 2, and later they were like a real brother and sister to me.
Amos Jr.'s children were Lemuel Leon, William, Thelma Ann, Lydia Lucille, Glenda Ray, Mildred Irene, Ruby Maureen, and Faye.
Amos Jr. was married to Fidelia Haskell in 1891 by Bishop Hans Funk on Wednesday evening at 8:30 in the Amos Clarke home. Aunt Miriam sent the wedding cake. When this wedding took place, Amos divided the land between the boys, and then Amos Jr. spent much of his time working at buying grain and on his own farm. That left David to care for the farm. When George got married, he came home and helped David with the farm work.
Amos and Ann's 10th child, David, and his wife Martha lived in a little rock 2-room across the street from Amos. They had 2 children at that time, and another one born later. They had a girl and 2 boys.
David and Martha's children were Vella Ann, Lemuel Floyd, and Dora Robert.
Prominent in civic and church work, David was the youngest of Amos and Ann's 10 children. He was a lifelong resident of Newton. He attended the Newton School and the Brigham Young College in Logan, but spent most of his time helping his father by taking responsibility of the farm work. He was very good with animals. He served as mayor of Newton for 14 years, from 1925 to 1940, and was town board member for 14 more years, from 1944 to 1958. He also served as a counselor to 2 bishoprics. On January 24, 1901, he married Martha Jane Cooley in the Logan Temple. Sephora continues to describe her life in Newton when she first arrived there.
The church house was a frame building with a big pot-bellied stove in one end for heating purposes. There was 1 classroom in the basement and an upstairs room for prayer meetings. The church was used for everything, dances and all amusements. All news happenings were given out from the stand on Sunday. All town announcements were given after or before meetings, such as when the tithing office would be open, what time the cattle would be branded and where, who would be driving the cattle to the field to graze, whose turn it was to take the water, and from whom, and so on. That is where people met, so that is how they found out about things. All the amusements were held in the meeting house. There was a dance on Friday nights. They were only allowed 2 waltzes an evening. There was the 2-step and schottische. The rest were the Virginia reel and other square dances. There was always a floor manager. Old and young danced together. In winter, they rode in the bobsleighs, pulled by 2 horses. Straw was put in the bottom of the sleigh, and a quilt over it, and quilts to keep warm, as the weather was extremely cold. Sometimes hoops and a canvas cover was put up, like a tent, to keep the cold out.
The townspeople worked together to clear the streets and to take care of their community and themselves. Sephora said that she learned to darn socks, and Amos's mittens that he wore in the blacksmith shop to handle the hot irons. He didn't believe in wasting anything, so the more patches that were put on the mittens, the better he liked them. Anne was so comical, she said they looked like 2 club feet.
The Clarke home was sort of a halfway house. They had lots of callers, travelers, and businessmen on their way by buggy from Logan on to Clarkston. They would stop overnight and eat, as there was no hotel in town, and the Clarkes had room and plenty of good food. Auntie was a good cook, always prepared, and she liked to set a nice table.
This is her sugar bowl. Sephora and the granddaughters worked for her and helped her. Persis Rigby was one of the granddaughters who helped her a great deal. Anne was always kind and gentle, always neat and clean. She was an immaculate housekeeper, and boarded several of the school teachers. She was a very good manager. Her older granddaughters who helped her remember how she had such a sweet way of making them feel important to her. She was the same with all the granddaughters who helped. She would tell them how she liked them to scrub, as they had such good, strong arms. She would say, "Scrub hard. No one will ever ask how long it took to do it, but if it isn't done well, they'll ask who did it." All of her floors and porches were scrubbed white as snow. The granddaughters could use all the soft soap they wanted. This soft soap was kept in a jar. It was her homemade soap that didn't harden. Anne would also have the granddaughters scour the knives and forks with brick dust and ashes. Her cupboard was full of pretty dishes, and her table was set very beautifully. She was a charming hostess to her boarders. Anne had such an outstanding cellar. The walls were whitewashed, and the floor was covered with rocks laid smooth. They would scour these rocks with another special rock that Amos had readied for them to use. In this cellar they churned butter with an old-fashioned dash churn. They would make 6 or 8 pounds at a time. Anne had a butter mold that made a very pretty design on each pound. About twice a year a stock company would come through and put on a show for 4 or 5 nights in the meeting house. All of them made at Clarke's, and some slept there, and some at Baker's or Benson's, as there wasn't enough sleeping room for all. It meant lots of preparations, cooking, setting tables for the crew, for 3 meals a day. Everything had to be home-cooked, breads, cakes, and pies, etc. Anne was the bread and pastry cook, and a good one, too. There were lots of things to learn from those pioneers. During these times, Anne appreciated her granddaughters' help and would often pay them with some of the money she earned from the company. In January 1905, George lost the sight in his eye by cleaning batteries. He was working in a telegraph office in Murray, Utah. He got some acid in his eye. He was blind in that eye for the rest of his life. He came home to recover, and then stayed in Newton. By the summer of 1905, George's eye had healed enough that he helped on the farm. He and David quarried rock and hauled it for David's house, and Carl Johnson built it. Martha and David were living in a 2-room house east of Amos Clarke's. Vella, Doral, and Floyd were born in the little house. However, now they needed some more room. In the spring of 1906, David began building. It was constructed out of the same sandstone that Amos and Anne's home was made of, and was a 2-story home. Dave worked with his father and others to become skilled in cattle and horse selling and breed developing. Horses were so important because they furnished the power for the farm work and for transportation. In the early days in Newton, the horses were small and for the most part of inferior quality. David, with a group of men, formed together to improve the quality of their horses. In 1905, they paid $2,800 for Tardau, an imported 3-year-old French Percheron stallion. The horse companies served almost all the horses in the area, and all profits were shared among the members of the company. They were able to make a great difference in the size and quality of the horses. In the second decade of the 20th century, horses remained the chief source of non-human power. In the third decade, mechanical power came in. In 1906, Sephora and George were engaged, so plans were started to build a small house in Newton on George's lot next to Amos Clarke's. Sephora was baptized into the Mormon Church in September 1906 in Bear River, down by the old rock quarry, by Bishop Martin C. Rigby.
Martin Rigby was like our big brother. George drove us in the Studebaker White Top with a team of horses. It was a very cold Saturday. That event pleased Uncle Amos very much, me being the first to join the church, besides him and his wife. After the baptism, George rolled me up in a quilt and put a scarf over my long, dripping hair. I didn't catch a cold, nor suffer from rheumatic fever, which I was subject to, so it all helped to strengthen my testimony of the gospel. I was confirmed by William Griffin, Lizzie Clarke's husband.
Sephora credited her conversion to the church to Anne and her gentle ways and gentle words. Sephora quit working in the store and got busy in piecing some quilts for her trousseau. She recounts her experience quilting with Anne.
I pieced 3 tops. The folks had some sheep, so we had our own wool. I found it quite a job to wash it and get it ready to be carded. I didn't know what carded meant, but soon found out. Then Auntie had a quilting bee, which lasted a few days, and invited a lot of good quilters, and we fed them. They were a jolly bunch. It was the first time I had seen a quilt put on a frame. In those days, very few blankets were used, and outing flannel sheets were used on the beds in winter.
Sephora and George Clarke were married in October of 1907. We are grateful to Sephora for her life story, as it gives us a look at Amos and Anne's daily life. This ends the quotes from her.
George and Sephora's children were Oswald George, Trevor Samuel, and Gwenva May.
As the Clarke grandchildren were growing up in Newton, there were cousins by the dozens. There were 55 grandchildren to Amos and Anne. The cousins worked together, sang together, played together, and worshipped together. From the choir book they sang many duets in church. Many of Amos's grandchildren were the same ages and therefore great friends. Orpah, a granddaughter, shares a tender story with us.
On September 14th, 1898, my mother Sarah was at the bedside of her sister Mary, who was giving birth to her 9th child, Golden, who was born at 9 a.m. That evening, Sarah gave birth to her 9th child, Orpah Vendeline, at 9 p.m.
On February 5th, 1907, a shock came to the Clarke family. Their son-in-law, William F. Rigby, Jr., was killed in an accident with a train at Cache Junction. This left their daughter, Sarah, with 11 living children and the baby Ray that had been born on June 9, 1906. Adding to the tragedy, Ora, one of Sarah's sons, died a year after his father in a farming accident. Here are the 10 remaining children of Sarah Angeline Clarke. In the back row from the left, there was Ray, Amos, Samuel, David, and Rulon. The front row, Lula, Edith, Persis, Elizabeth, Letty, and Orpah. In 1910, the Farmers Banking Company of Cache Junction was organized. George C. Rigby, son-in-law of the Clarkes, was president, and Sarah's son Rulon Rigby and M.J. Beck were cashiers. Amos Clarke was a promoter and a stockholder in the new bank. In August 1910, Amos and Anne's son, Amos Richard Edward Clarke, died of a ruptured appendix. Even though he was operated on in the Logan Hospital, peritonitis set in. His death left his widow, Fidelia, and 6 children. The youngest 2 children were only 2 and 3 years old. In the Journal, September 3, 1910, it said, "The funeral was one of the largest ever held in Newton, men dropping the important work of harvesting and threshing to attend, and the crowded house and beautiful floral offerings, the evident sadness of the assemblage, and the large cortege that followed the remains of their brother and friend, all bore testimony to the high regard in which Brother Clarke was held. Aside from his excellent public reputation, he was a loving husband and kind father, and his family has sustained an irreparable loss. His time was cut short, but his work was well done." Amos and Anne were heartbroken at this great loss. Amos was very depressed and ill after this death in the family. At 77 years of age, he spent more time in the garden and working with his genealogical books and work. He spent less time in the shop and more time resting. During this time in his life, his granddaughter, Vella, gave us another description of Amos.
I always liked to hold his hand and run along by his side. By then he was more stooped and walked more slowly. He still conveyed that great security for me, which I always felt in his presence. Then his hair and beard were white. His face was more wrinkled, but his eyes were still blue and twinkly, and his smile pleasant. He always had a peppermint, horehound, or lemon drop for me. He always carried nickels and dimes, change in his pocket for his grandchildren. He was always willing to share, to help others. He didn't believe anyone should be imposed upon. He believed in law and order and obeyed, and that laws were made by all people, and that they should be obeyed and kept by all the people. If he believed in any principle, he wasn't ashamed or afraid to stand up for it and say so.
Another granddaughter, Orpah, also describes the devotion of Anne to grandchildren. She said, "I can still see Grandma Clarke putting her hand in her skirt pocket and bringing out horehound candy for us when we go to visit her." Amos blessed most of his grandchildren and many of his great-grandchildren. His whole family loved and respected him. Lula Rigby shared this memory about being blessed. Grandpa Clarke had come to our home to bless Sarah's son Ray. It was about 2 months after Will Jr. had been killed. He gave Ray a blessing, and then they realized that for some reason Lula had not been blessed. She was 4 years old at the time. It was decided to give her a blessing then also. Since she was feeling shy about getting a blessing, she ran through the kitchen into the parlor, and one of her brothers or sisters chased her up and down the stairs to bring her back so she could be blessed. As she told the story, she added, "Being that old, why did I ever accept Lula for a name?" Though he had begun to work less in 1913, Amos Clarke was still a master blacksmith. At 80 years of age, he shaped a steel band 24 inches in diameter, 2 inches wide, and 1.5 inches thick, to shrink on an eccentric disc of a steam engine for the Jonas Brothers Threshing Company in Newton, Utah. This required an unusually full knowledge and skill of metalwork to determine the length of a straight piece of steel to be shaped in a circle, with allowance made to weld the two ends together and fit tight enough that the band would not break when it was shrunk on the disc. The band was still on the eccentric disc 20 years after the repair had been made and the steam engine junked. The repair in those days was necessary because the grain crop was ripe and ready to be harvested. The hub of the eccentric disc was cracked, and it would have taken 3 or 4 weeks to have a new disc shipped from Racine, Wisconsin to Newton, Utah. In 1914, George, Sephora, and their 2 sons went to Wales to visit family members. It had been 10 years since Sephora had seen her parents. While they were there, World War I broke out. In June 1917, Amos Clarke had another stroke and lost his speech and was quite helpless. One day in September, when Amos was chopping some wood for the stove, Anne noticed how everything got quiet at the wood pile, and the chopping had stopped. She hurried to see what was wrong. There she saw Amos had fallen and lay quiet on the ground. Anne soon had help. David was close by, so she called him. Soon the family came and a doctor was called. When the doctor came, he said that Amos had had a stroke. This strong and sturdy man had fallen and was unable to care for himself. In those days, when Anne needed help, she would have one of her many granddaughters or her daughters-in-law come to her home to help her with the cleaning and his care. Martha, David's wife, came every morning to bathe and care for Amos. He liked her to help him, as she was so kind and gentle. Martha and Sephora took turns caring for him. Sephora said, "I'll never forget his sweet smile when I would go over to help him and to feed him." All he could do was smile his appreciation. His condition gradually worsened, and he passed away on February 27, 1918. The funeral was a large one, and he was buried on the Clarke lot in the Newton Cemetery. Anne Johnston Clarke was very lonely after her husband's death, and several of her granddaughters took turns staying with her. Her granddaughter Lula Rigby recorded this experience about staying with her grandmother.
During the next months, the granddaughters took turns staying a week at a time with grandmother. I had my turn also. I was 15. One night as we knelt in prayer, Grandma prayed that Sarah, my mother, could be relieved of her suffering and be called home. After we stood up, Grandma could see I was upset. I couldn't conceive of praying for a person to die. Grandma said, "It would be so much better if your mother didn't have to suffer. I would be so much happier if I knew she had been called home rather than suffering like she is." At the time, Sarah was suffering from cancer and in so much pain. Although Anne started to waste away after Amos's death, her mind was clear and bright. She got influenza and it affected her heart. Her daughter Mary was with her when she died. Just before she passed away, she kept repeating, "It's beautiful, Mary, it's beautiful." She died on December 16th, 1918, just 10 months after the death of her beloved husband. On account of the flu, the meetings were closed, so her funeral service was held outdoors on the south side of George's house. There was snow on the ground, but the day was sunny. The winter of 1918 and the spring of 1919 was a hard one, and very deep snow made it worse. The flu was terrible and greatly affected the Clarke family. The town was full of it. Everyone everywhere had to wear masks by law. The newspapers of 1919 are full of articles about the flu and the end of World War I.
Other family members were soon to follow in death. Elizabeth Clarke Griffin, or Lizzie as she was called, died January 2nd, 1919, just 2 weeks after her mother. She had a weak heart, and when she also got the flu, it was too much for her. The local paper, the Journal, states, "When the influenza epidemic was raging in the vicinity, the Griffin family was attacked by the germ. The mother struggled bravely in caring for her children, and at last she became a victim to the disease. She partially recovered from the disease, but the effects proved to be weakening. Although she rallied for 2 months, she gradually grew weaker until the end. With all the suffering she passed through, not a murmur was made. She lived for her children, and when all was well with them, all was well with her." Her husband William Griffin died 17 years later, in 1936. Anne and Lizzie's deaths were not the end of the influenza toll on the Clarke family. In 1918, George C. Rigby, son-in-law, had the influenza and shortly thereafter had a stroke, and was in ill health until his death, April 1st, 1921, at the age of 59. Then, 3.5 months later, on April 10th, 1919, Sarah Angeline Clarke Rigby died. Finally, her terrible suffering from cancer was over. Her daughter Persis had been so devoted in caring for her mother. All of the children had been devoted to her care. Because of her illness from colon cancer, there was so much washing needed. The washing at that time was done in a tin tub on the scrubbing board, the water heated on the stove. Persis said, "This was done out of love. I wouldn't do it for pay." 17 months later, Annie Clarke Jenkins died on August 26, 1920. Friends and family who attended her funeral commented on the faithful, honest, and devoted life she'd lived. She was buried in the Newton Cemetery. Her husband, John Jenkins, died 16 years later, in 1936. From 1918 to 1920, a father and mother and 3 sisters were gone. Thus the remaining members of the Clarke family were Mary Clarke Rigby, Lemuel George Clarke, and David Clarke. They all lived to be quite elderly. Pictured here are 2 of Amos and Anne's surviving children in their older years. From left to right, Amos Rigby and his mother, Mary Clarke Rigby, George Clarke and his wife Sephora. Mary and George both died in 1958. Before that year, Mary spent quite a bit of time in California because her daughter Liberty lived there. In 1943, George and Sephora moved to California to be near their daughter Gwenva. Sephora died in 1976. David Clarke died at his home in Newton, September 6, 1960. Martha, David's wife, died in 1968. For many years after their death, the home of Amos and Anne Clarke stood in Newton, the big A's guarding the stability of the walls, even though it stood empty for many years. Think of the memories that were contained within those walls. Since music was such an integral part of their lives, it is fitting that the old organ remained inside of it for many years after it was empty. Eventually, a great-granddaughter, Diane Hendricks, asked to have it and refinished it. Even though the keys are gone, it has an honored spot in her home. For a period of time, Amos's grandson Oswell and Opal Clarke lived in half of Amos and Ann's old home. Eventually, however, they moved out, and the Clarke home remained empty for at least 50 years. During part of that time, the home was on the Utah Register of Historical Places. In 2004, Amos and Ann's home was taken down because the years had begun to take their toll. These are 4 different views of the home taken by great-granddaughter Nalene Fabricius Hansey just before it was taken down. The home was over 120 years old. The walls were still intact, but the wooden roof couldn't last. How do we summarize the lives of these 2 faithful and noble people? They desired to follow the teachings of the Bible and were not satisfied until they found the restored gospel. Once they found it, they remained true and faithful to their testimonies and to each other, their children, and their grandchildren. Were their lives easy? No, I don't think so. They dealt with the loss of loved ones and hard physical labor to provide for themselves. However, despite hardships, they succeeded and kept moving forward. We can learn from their example. Amos and Ann Clarke's story is still being written in the lives of their great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren.